Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one we'll start out in the eastern parts of the front line as there are a few developments. Then we'll move on to the main part, which is the Ukrainian Kursk and now Belgorod offensive. Starting out in the east, we see that the Russians have managed to capture a further part of Konstantinivka. With their foothold gained and consolidated, they are now pushing into the central parts of the town, following their foothold in the east. This leads to the situation deteriorating for the Ukrainians due to the cut-off of the road to the south of it and to the north of it, leaving only one supply line to the west of it, which is constantly under Russian bombardment, together with the increased Russian presence in the town. At the same time, in the further north in Toretsk direction, the Russians are storming the apartment complex area east of Toretsk, the main defensive position of the Ukrainians in the eastern parts of the city, following the second line of defense. As previously mentioned, a Russian foothold and control over the apartment complex area will significantly deteriorate the defensive position of Toretsk in the city itself, as the Russians would have a overview over the entirety of the city, the entire eastern parts of it, and will be able to consolidate a foothold to then gain access to the residential area and forest areas in the central parts and eastern parts of the city. So the Russians are putting heavy emphasis on taking control over the apartment complex area quickly to significantly improve their positions in the area and go beyond the second line of defense completely by getting control over the next line of defense. Finally, in the north by Ryurivka, there was some positional fighting here in the area. After the Russians captured the first line, they have now started to push towards the Ukrainian fortified positions beyond the next first line and south of Ryurivka. And that is it for the eastern updates, where the Russians continued offensive operations despite the Ukrainian offensive in the north. Talking about the Ukrainian offensive in the north, the Ukrainians have been trying for the past few days to expand their foothold into the Belgorod region. They attempted to cross over multiple border crossings. One of such is here by Bezimeno, where we have this geolocated footage of fighting taking place by the border area. However, unlike this Kursk direction between Sumy and Kursk, there is a difference in this section of the front line, and that is that the Russians do have defensive lines and positions in this section of the front line. In the Sumy direction, the Russians were removing some of their fortifications ahead of their own offensive. This is to avoid falling into those. However, the Ukrainians took notice of that and launched their operation when the fortifications were completely removed, leaving just a clear and empty road for them to drive through. Now we see here, both in the direction of Bezimeno here in the southeast, where the Ukrainians have to go through dragon teeth and minefields, they ended up getting hit and destroyed prior to even reaching the first village in the Belgorod region. Similarly, in Kolotilovka, there is this geolocated footage of a Ukrainian vehicle driving along the dragon teeth, maybe looking for a gap in the defenses because it just simply could not drive through. And driving by, it actually got hit by a mine, which disabled the vehicle, but it seems like the crew survived. So we see that the Ukrainians are unable to enter Kolotilovka and Bezimeno. However, that is not the end of the story. We see here further north that the Ukrainians, following the capture of the village of Guevo, crossed the river into Plechovo, where they managed to capture that village. And with that, the Ukrainians now had a foothold across where they could enter from the Russian-Ukrainian border to then push onwards towards Spelnoe. And capturing this area here allowed the Ukrainians to spread out the Russian forces to attempt to plug the gap. This led to several offensive operations by the Ukrainians along the forested area of the border, where they managed to move on to Russians' villages and towns up to 12 kilometers deep into the southern part of the Kursk region. We do, however, also notice that the majority of this is in a gray zone. That is because we have seen a lot of Ukrainian vehicles and soldiers go beyond these first positions. However, every single one of them was followed by a complete wipe out of that unit. The footage that the Russians are posting are constantly of new ambushes and just complete destruction of the Ukrainian soldiers moving this deep into Russian lands. There are two main reasons for this. The first one is that this is far from the front line, far from actual Ukrainian presence. This is the initial grouping of forces. Therefore, they are much weaker than the current force fighting further north in the Kursk region. Therefore, we see that this is just a few armored groups and squads with their allocated infantry trying to push into Russian territory. And this is very difficult for these Ukrainian soldiers to deal with Russian forces, who, as the second part mentions, are already there. The first one was unexpected for the Russians. They were not prepared to stop them instantly. But now the Russians are actually present in the area. This means that the previous Ukrainian strategy, where they drove up to a fortified position and then sent additional forces beyond to go on to the next fortified position, while the first ones are still fighting, does not work anymore. Because once they go to the first line of defense and then they split off into the second push, the second push is also going to find a significant resistance, and those are typically going to get ambushed because the first defensive position notifies the second defensive position about this upcoming assault, and the Russians prepare for it. They leave off an empty area and ambush the Ukrainians once they arrive at the next line of defense. One such example of this is this footage here showing a Russian BTR fighting a Ukrainian BTR in an ambush, where the Ukrainian BTR is looking off to the side, then suddenly it gets hit by the Russian BTR, and the Russian BTR manages to disable the Ukrainian one with just a few shots, forcing the Ukrainian crew to evacuate it, and it is not clear what happens afterwards because of the electronic warfare jamming the drone, but we do see some signs that additional firing is taking place on the crew. So we see that this unit was either going to put up positions within the few houses in the area, where they would be completely isolated from other Ukrainian groups and completely by themselves, which with a Russian BTR nearby means that you can expect them to be completely wiped out either by taking prisoners or fighting to the end. There's a lot more footage of the fighting here in this area. However, much of it is not safe to show here on YouTube to avoid getting rid of my channel. Therefore, I'll be moving on to the Sucha direction, where the Ukrainians have gained full control over the central parts and have pushed further in the eastern parts, where the Russians only have a small foothold in the eastern parts. This is from a Russian withdrawal from the central parts into the eastern parts due to the fear of getting encircled, especially with the Ukrainian push to the south, which has led to the road here being in danger, because if the Ukrainians manage to capture Giri, they would be able to cut off the one supply route the Russians have in the eastern parts. This means that this is not a completely illogical push. This is actually a very well made and thought out push, where the Ukrainians here are looking to cut off the Russian supplies to the eastern parts of Sucha and force them to withdraw towards Mertionovka, which would leave a gap here in this area right here. So the Ukrainians are here attempting to hit the supply line. The Russians do still have roads in between areas. However, this is one of the main roads going to it, and it is actually a railway as well, which means that the Russians could have train tracks all the way close to the front before dismounting it and launching it close up with the trucks. So we see that there is going to be a hit towards the Russian supply with the Ukrainian presence here. The final advance further north is continuous Ukrainian pushes towards Kremenoe due to the failure to get a foothold within Korenevo. They are now moving on to the side villages. They were also pushed out of Snagost, which led to them focusing on the northern parts, where positional fighting is taking place both by Malia Luknia and Kremenoe. So we see that the Ukrainians continue their offensive operations in the central parts, where they already have their massive foothold. and this has significantly slowed down, so they tried to expand it to the side, which has seen both large successes and large failures due to the same strategy not working twice. And before you tell me, you said the Ukrainians will not gain large advances again. I was saying not from opening another front. This is due to the fortified positions that the Ukrainians have to drive through. For example, we have the Dragon Teeth, as is shown here. Most Ukrainian vehicles cannot drive through it. The height of these Dragon Teeth is about the height of a human soldier, and we see that with this footage here of Ukrainian soldiers along the Dragon Teeth. They want to infiltrate. However, some of them end up stepping on mines, some of them end up getting shot at, and they have to withdraw. There's also likely barbed wire in between the Dragon Teeth. You can just barely see it at the edge. It is covered in the grass, which makes it very difficult for the Ukrainian soldiers to even pass through. So we see that even infiltration troops are stopped at the border. Not to mention that it is also mined. With this vehicle here, we see that it eventually drives up into a mine, completely obliterating the tank. We also see this additional footage here, showing the Ukrainians moving through with Humvees at night. And this actually made me realize something, because during the summer period, the light is shorter, therefore the time of darkness is also shorter, and this is likely why it is also chosen as a time for offensive operations, because nighttime has an advantage to the defender and a disadvantage to the attacker if the technology is at an equal level. Based on all of this, we can see that the Ukrainians have no intention of simply stopping with what they have gained so far and turning it into a defensive operation. Instead, they want to continue being on the offensive, and this makes me think that the entirety of the Ukrainian reserve built up over the last year will be used on this offensive. There are reports of additional brigades being sent. We already have over 10,000 soldiers, and the estimated amount of Ukrainian soldiers which were built with these 14 brigades is between 28 to 56,000, closer to the 28 mark, and it is likely that the Ukrainians will send all of those into this Kursk-Belgorod offensive, and that their plan is simply to cause as much havoc as possible with those units before they run out. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.